The translation device crackled with static as Counselor Draven's fist slammed onto the obsidian table, and every delegate in the Accord chamber fell silent. Ambassador Kale Morrow, humanity's sole representative on Thalashan Station, did not flinch, though he was acutely aware that the nearest armed guard stood 3 paces behind his chair. He had said something wrong, and the temperature of the room told him exactly how wrong. "You dare," Draven hissed through mandibles that clicked with barely contained fury, "speak of the Empress in such a manner?" Kale kept his hands flat on the table, visible, unthreatening. He had learned that posture in the first month. The Velshari were a species obsessed with the geometry of the body, how one held their limbs, the angle of the chin, the openness of the palms. Every movement was a sentence. Every stillness, a paragraph. "I stated a fact," Kale said evenly. "Not an insult. You called the Empress of the Velshari Dominion lonely." Draven's secondary eyes narrowed, the smaller pair beneath the primary set focusing with predatory precision. "In our culture, to name someone's weakness before the council is to challenge their fitness for rule. You have effectively called for her deposition." The silence that followed was not the silence of diplomacy. It was the silence of a blade being drawn. Kale exhaled slowly. He thought of Earth, of the apartment in Ankara he would never return to, of the daughter whose funeral he had attended via a pixelated screen 14 light years away. He thought of how he had taken this post because there was nothing left to lose, and how that particular kind of freedom made a man dangerous in ways no one expected. "I did not call for her deposition," Kale said. "I said that a ruler who has been rejected by every noble house is a bonding partner, who sits on a throne surrounded by subjects who fear her but never approach her, who has not heard a sincere word in 17 years of reign. I said that ruler was lonely, and I stand by it." The murmur that rippled through the chamber was not of the verbal kind. The Velshari communicated layers of emotion through subtle bioluminescent pulses along their temples and throat. The chamber flickered in hues of deep violet and sharp amber, outrage laced with something Kale had learned to recognize as reluctant acknowledgement. Draven rose to his full height, nearly 8 feet of lean, silver-skinned authority. "The Empress will hear of this. Every word." "Good," Kale said. "Someone should talk to her. It might as well be about the truth." He was escorted from the chamber by 4 guards in ceremonial armor that hummed with low-frequency deterrence fields. They did not speak to him. They did not need to. Their formation, tight square, weapons powered but not drawn, communicated the message clearly. You are not a prisoner yet, but the distance between guest and prisoner has never been shorter. His quarters on Thalashan Station were modest by any standard. A single room with a sleeping alcove, a workstation, and a viewport that looked out onto the nebula the Velshari called the Mother's Veil. Humanity had been granted observer status in the Galactic Accord 7 years ago, and in that time, they had sent 19 ambassadors. Kale was the 19th. The previous 18 had resigned, been recalled, or in 2 cases, simply disappeared. He sat on the edge of his bed and pressed his palms against his eyes. Hilara's face flickered behind his lids, 6 years old, laughing, reaching for him with small hands. Then the hospital. Then the screen. Then nothing. The door chimed. He composed himself with the efficiency of a man who had long ago learned that grief was a private language. Enter. The figure that stepped through was not a guard. She was tall, nearly 7 feet, with skin the color of deep twilight, threaded with veins of soft bioluminescence that pulsed in slow, controlled rhythms. Her features were angular, almost severe, with high cheekbones and eyes that held the pale luminosity of twin moons. She wore no crown, but the way the air itself seemed to defer to her presence made the ornament unnecessary. Behind her stood 2 attendants whose bioluminescent patterns screamed alarm in shades of crimson. Empress Salith Vorthane of the Velshari Dominion looked at Kale Morrow with an expression that could have frozen starlight. "Find me the man who insulted my honor," she said, her voice low and precise as a surgical instrument. "That is what I told my guard captain, and they brought me here." Kale stood. Not quickly. He had learned the cost of sudden movements. He rose with the measured deliberation the Velshari respected, though he suspected no amount of cultural fluency would save him from what was coming. "Your Eminence, you are the human ambassador. I am. You are the one who stood before my council and called me." Her jaw tightened. The bioluminescent threads along her throat flared a deep, humiliated indigo. "Lonely. I did. The attendants behind her exchanged a rapid-fire sequence of light pulses. Kale caught fragments, reckless, unaware, primitive. But he had stopped caring about alien assessments of humanity somewhere around Ambassador Number 12's mysterious departure. Salith stepped closer. She moved like something between a dancer and a predator, each motion calibrated to project authority. But Kale had spent years reading people, human and otherwise, and he saw what the calibration was designed to hide. Uncertainty. "Do you understand what you have done?" she asked. "I've been told I challenged your fitness to rule. You have declared before the Accord that the Empress of the most powerful dominion in the quadrant is deficient, incomplete, that she lacks what even the lowest bonded pair possesses." Her voice did not waver, but the light along her collarbone flickered erratically, a tell she could not control. "You have named me broken." Kale met her gaze. Her eyes were extraordinary, pale silver with rings of violet that shifted like gas clouds. He wondered how many beings had looked into those eyes and seen only power, only danger, only the throne behind them. "No," he said quietly. "I named you alone. There's a difference." Something shifted in her expression. It was small, a fractional widening of the eyes, a slight parting of the lips, but in a species that controlled every micro-expression like a chess move, it was the equivalent of a scream. She turned sharply to her attendants. "Leave us, Empress," one began. I said leave. They left. The door sealed with a hiss of pressurized atmosphere. Salith stood in his quarters, the smallest, most insignificant room on the station, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The mother's veil cast shifting light through the viewport, painting them both in shades of violet and blue. "Why?" she asked. The single word held none of the imperial authority. It was stripped down, raw, almost human in its simplicity. Kale sat back down on the edge of his bed. Not out of disrespect, but because he recognized the question for what it was, and it deserved an honest answer from a man who was not performing. "Because I've been here for 14 months, he said. "And in that time, I've watched every noble house send representatives to the Accord, and not one of them speaks to you directly. They speak to your title. They speak to your military. They speak to the idea of you. But no one speaks to you." He paused. "I know what that looks like. I know what it costs." Salith's hands, long-fingered, elegant, faintly luminous, curled at her sides. "You presume to understand a Velshari Empress." "No, Dekundere. I presume to understand loneliness. The species doesn't matter." The silence that followed was different from the one in the council chamber. This one was not the silence of a blade being drawn. It was the silence of a wound being seen for the first time. Salith's throat pulsed a color Kale had never seen before, a deep, aching blue that was almost beautiful in its sadness. "You are either the most foolish creature in this quadrant," she said, "or the most dangerous. I've been told those are the same thing." She studied him for a long moment. The small room, the single bed, the viewport, the man who sat in it. All of it like someone who had already lost everything and found a strange freedom in the wreckage. "The council will demand consequences," she said. "I know. I could have you expelled, or detained. You could. You are not afraid." Kale looked at her, and for the first time, he allowed the careful neutrality to slip. Just enough for her to see the grief beneath it, the hollow, well-worn architecture of a man who had buried his world. "No," he said. "I'm not." Salith Vorthane turned and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the release panel. "The council session reconvenes at the 6th cycle," she said, her voice once again imperial, controlled. "You will attend. Am I being summoned or invited?" The faintest flicker of something, not quite amusement, not quite warmth, crossed her features. "In the Velshari Dominion, there is no difference." She left. Kale sat alone in the shifting light of the nebula and wondered, not for the first time, if telling the truth was the bravest or the most reckless thing a human could do. The 6th cycle session was not what Kale expected. The Accord chamber had been reconfigured. Where yesterday's session had seated 43 delegates in a broad semicircle, today's arrangement was intimate, a circular table with only 7 seats. 5 were occupied by Velshari nobles, whose bioluminescent patterns radiated careful, controlled neutrality. 1 seat was empty, reserved by its ornate design for the Empress. And 1 seat, plain, unadorned, conspicuously human-sized, waited for Kale. Counselor Draven was present, his mandibles locked in a position Kale had come to associate with barely restrained hostility. Beside him sat a female Velshari whom Kale did not recognize, older, her bioluminescence muted to the soft, steady glow of someone who had long ago mastered the art of revealing nothing. Ambassador Morrow. Draven's voice carried the warmth of orbital debris. Be seated. Kale sat. He noted that the deterrence field on his chair was active, a subtle hum against his lower back that would paralyze him from the waist down if triggered. A precaution, or a message? With the Velshari, the distinction was academic. The older female spoke. I'm Matriarch Velshura, first mother of House Forthane. Her pale eyes, the same moonlit silver as Salith's, though worn at the edges, regarded him with the clinical precision of a surgeon evaluating where to cut. You are the human who spoke of my granddaughter's solitude before the full council. I am. You understand that in 3,700 years of Velshari governance, no foreign delegate has ever publicly named an empress's personal condition. I'm aware of the precedent, or the lack of one. Velshura's glow shifted, a subtle warm amber that Kale read as reluctant intrigue. Tell me, human, on your world, is it customary to dissect the emotional state of your leaders before their court? Kale considered the question. On my world, we have a long history of either ignoring our leaders' emotional states until they make catastrophic decisions, or exploiting those states for political gain. I did neither. I stated an observation. An observation, Draven repeated, his secondary eyes narrowing. You observed that the sovereign of our dominion is lonely, as though she were a specimen. As though she were a person, Kale corrected. The room's bioluminescence shifted collectively, a ripple of conflicting signals that Kale could only partially decode. Shock, certainly, and something beneath it, something the nobles were working very hard to suppress. The door opened, and Salith entered. She was different today. Her formal robes were replaced by something simpler, still regal, but less armored. The fabric was a deep, living blue that shifted with her movement, and her bioluminescence was deliberately dimmed, as though she had chosen to speak softly rather than announce. Kale noticed, and he suspected she knew he noticed. She took her seat without greeting anyone, which was apparently customary. But her gaze moved to Kale first, before the nobles, and in the language of Velshari protocol, that was a statement louder than any words. This session has been convened, Velshura said, to determine the appropriate response to the human ambassador's breach of decorum. The options before us range from formal censure to expulsion from the Accord. There is also the matter, Draven added, his mandibles clicking with satisfaction, of whether the human's words constitute grounds for the dissolution of the dissolution. Human observer status entirely. Kale felt the weight of that. 7 years of diplomatic groundwork. 19 ambassadors. Humanity's fragile foothold in a galactic community that viewed them as barely evolved primates with nuclear weapons, and an unsettling talent for persistence. Before consequences are discussed, Salith said, and the room stilled instantly, I would hear the human speak again. Draven's patterns flashed crimson. Empress, the insult has already been recorded. Further, I did not ask for your analysis, Counselor. I asked to hear the human. The silence was absolute. Kale understood the dynamic. Salith was asserting authority not over him, but over the nobles who used his words as ammunition against her. By demanding he speak, she was taking ownership of the narrative. It was a political move, but it was also something else. Something the Velshari in the room were trying very hard not to see. It was courage. Kale stood. The deterrence field hummed louder against his spine, but he ignored it. Your Eminence, members of the Council. He spoke clearly without rush. I am the 19th human ambassador to this station. Of the 18 before me, most were career diplomats trained in the art of saying nothing with great eloquence. They followed every protocol. They caused no breaches. And they accomplished nothing, because the Velshari do not respect caution. They interpret it as fear. He saw Velshura's glow shift. He continued, I was not sent here because I am skilled at diplomacy. I was sent because there was no one left to send. I am a teacher by training, a widower by circumstance, and a father by... He paused. The word caught. By memory. I have no career to protect, no advancement to seek. The only thing I have is an inconvenient habit of saying what I see." He looked at Salith. She held his gaze with that preternatural stillness. "What I see," he said, "is an empress who has ruled alone for 17 years. Whose bonding proposals have been rejected by every major house, not because she is unworthy, but because she is too powerful to be safely partnered. Who has been surrounded by subjects who perform loyalty but offer no intimacy. Who has become so accustomed to isolation that she has learned to wear it as authority." The bioluminescence in the room was chaos, flares of indigo, crimson, amber, pale green. But Kale was watching only Salith, and Salith's light was steady, a deep, unwavering blue. "I called that loneliness," Kale said, "because that is what it is. And if naming it is an insult, then the insult lies not in my words, but in the silence that made them necessary." He sat down. The deterrence field was now humming at a frequency he could feel in his teeth. Draven spoke first. "This is precisely the kind of presumptuous. Enough." Velshura raised one hand. The single gesture carried more authority than Draven's entire performance. The old matriarch studied Kale with an expression he could not read. "You have lost a child," she said. It was not a question. "Yes? And you believe this loss gives you insight into the Empress's experience?" Kale shook his head. "No, Bior. I believe loss gives me permission to recognize it in others, without pretending it isn't there. That's all." Velshura turned to Salith. Something passed between them, grandmother and granddaughter, sovereign and matriarch, in a language of light that was too rapid and too intimate for Kale to follow. Then Salith stood. "The human ambassador will not be censured." Draven's patterns erupted. "Empress, he will instead be assigned to my advisory detail for a probationary period, during which his understanding of Velshari culture will be evaluated." She looked at Kale, and the faintest thread of warm amber wove through her steady blue. "If he is so committed to observation, he will observe at close range." Draven looked as though he had swallowed a live reactor core. "This is unprecedented." "Yes," Salith said. "It is." The session ended. The nobles filed out in a storm of suppressed light. Velshura lingered, her muted glow settling on Kale with something that was not warmth, not hostility, but the sharp-edged patience of a woman who had seen empires rise and fall, and was prepared to see one more thing through. "Human," she said quietly, as the chamber emptied. "My granddaughter has not been wrong in 17 years. That is not because she is infallible. It is because no one has been close enough to test her. And now she has invited a man with nothing to lose into her inner circle." Velshura's lips, thin, lined with age, curved in something almost like a smile. "Either she is finally making a mistake, or she is finally making a decision. I intend to watch closely to determine which." She left. Kale stood alone in the chamber, the deterrence field still humming against his chair, and thought about a woman who had ruled an empire in silence for 17 years and had just broken protocol to keep a stranger near. The probationary assignment began the next day, and it was by design an exercise in discomfort. Kale was given a schedule that mapped his waking hours to the Empress's public duties: council briefings, military reviews, diplomatic receptions, agricultural summits. He was given a position at her left shoulder, which he later learned was traditionally reserved for bonded partners or condemned prisoners. The Velshari, he decided, had a dark sense of humor. For the first 3 days, Salith did not speak to him directly. She spoke to her advisors, her generals, her delegates, and Kale stood at her left, watching, listening, learning. He watched her resolve a territorial dispute between 2 mining conglomerates with a single sentence. He watched her dismiss a military commander's plea for expanded fleet funding by reciting the commander's own supply reports from memory. He watched her receive the ambassador from the Kreth hegemony, a bloated, slug-like being who reeked of ammonia, with flawless grace while the ambassador's translator fumbled basic pronouns. She was extraordinary, and she was exhausted. Kale saw it in the way her bioluminescence dimmed in the moments between audiences, when the doors closed and the next petitioner had not yet been admitted. In those brief intervals, the Empress's light would flicker and fade, as though she were conserving energy for the next performance. And then the doors would open, and the light would blaze again, and the performance would resume. On the 4th day she spoke to him. They were in the Imperial Garden, a vast biodome aboard the station that housed flora from 17 Velshari colony worlds. The air was thick with pollen, and the sounds of creatures Kale could not name. Salith had dismissed her attendants and was standing before a tree whose bark glowed with a soft, pulsing amber. "This is a Velthon tree," she said without turning. "It bonds with a single other tree of its species. They share root systems, nutrients, chemical signals. If one dies, the other follows within a solar cycle." Kale stood at his assigned distance, 3 paces behind and to the left. A metaphor, an observation. She turned, and there was something in her expression, a wryness, a testing, that reminded him suddenly, painfully, of his wife. "You are fond of those. Occupational hazard. You were a teacher. I taught history, to children who would rather have been anywhere else. And now you teach empresses. I don't teach you anything. I stand behind your left shoulder and try not to sneeze during the Kreth ambassador's visits." Her lips pressed together, not in disapproval, but in the suppression of something she did not permit herself. It took Kale a moment to realize she was fighting a smile. "The ammonia is oppressive," she conceded. "It's an act of biological warfare." This time, the smile escaped. It was small, barely there, gone in an instant. But the bioluminescence along her throat shifted to a warm rose-gold hue that Kale had never seen in any Velshari. "My grandmother says you are either a fool or a catalyst," Salith said. "What do you think?" She considered him. In the garden's warm light, with her robes loosened and her luminescence unguarded, she looked less like an empress and more like a woman carrying a weight she had never been taught to set down. "I think," she said slowly, "that you are the first person in 17 years who has spoken to me as though I were merely a person. You say that like it's unusual. It is the rarest thing in the Dominion." Kale felt something shift in his chest, not the grief he carried like scar tissue, but something adjacent to it. A recognition, the awareness of standing before someone whose isolation mirrored his own, refracted through an alien lens but fundamentally, unmistakably the same. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You may. When was the last time someone asked you how you were? Not as Empress, just you." Her light dimmed. Not in the conserving way, in the way that meant the question had reached somewhere she had built walls around. She did not answer for a long time. The Velthon tree pulsed beside them, its amber glow slow and steady as a heartbeat. "I do not remember," she said. Kale nodded. He did not press. He did not offer comfort or platitudes or the kind of carefully constructed empathy that diplomats wielded like a tool. He simply stood with her in the garden, 2 solitary beings in the presence of a tree that could not survive alone, and let the silence be enough. After a while, Salith said, "You may walk beside me, not behind." It was a small shift, 3 paces forward and to the right. But in the language of Velshari protocol, it was an earthquake. The crisis came on the 23rd day. Kale had settled into the rhythm of Salith's world. The early briefings, the midday audiences, the evening reviews. He had learned to read the bioluminescent exchanges of her court with increasing fluency, and what he read disturbed him. The nobles were not merely skeptical of his presence. They were organizing. Draven was the nucleus. He had been quietly assembling a coalition of houses that viewed Salith's unprecedented attachment to a human, an alien, a species barely 2 centuries into interstellar travel, as evidence of the instability they had long suspected. The whisper was always the same. The Empress is compromised. The Empress is weak. The Empress has allowed a creature of no standing to occupy the position of a bonded partner. Kale knew this because Velshura told him. The old matriarch had taken to visiting his quarters every few days, always unannounced, always late in the cycle, always with the air of someone conducting an experiment and recording the results. "Draven has 14 houses aligned," she said, seated in Kale's only chair while he sat on the floor. He had offered the chair instinctively. She had accepted it as though it were a throne. "He will invoke the right of Velethar, which is a formal challenge to the Empress's judgment. If the council votes that her decision-making has been compromised by emotional attachment, she can be removed from the throne and replaced by a regent." Velshura's muted glow flickered. The regent would be Draven. Kale felt the implications settle like cold water. "And the evidence of her compromised judgment? You?" He closed his eyes. Of course. He was the weapon Draven had been looking for, proof that the Empress had elevated an inferior being to a position of intimacy, thereby demonstrating the weakness they had always attributed to her. His presence beside her was not a diplomatic curiosity. It was a loaded gun. "I should leave," he said. "If you leave, she loses the only honest voice in her court, and Draven wins by default." Veljura's eyes were steady. "If you stay, Draven uses you as the instrument of her removal. Then there's no good option. There is always an option. Human. It is merely a matter of what one is willing to sacrifice." She left, and Kale sat on the floor of his small room and thought about sacrifice. He thought about Alara, how he had sacrificed nothing, how the universe had simply taken her, and how the absence of choice was its own unbearable weight. He thought about Selith, who had spent 17 years sacrificing intimacy for power, and was now being punished for the first time she had reached across the void. He went to find her. She was in the war room, a vaulted chamber deep in the station's core, lined with holographic tactical displays. She was alone, which was unusual. The displays showed troop movements along the Dominion's border with the Kreth hegemony, but she was not looking at them. She was standing at the viewport, staring into the nebula, and her bioluminescence was the color of bruised twilight. "You've heard," she said. "Your grandmother told me." Of course she did. A faint, bitter pulse of light. "The First Mother plays all sides. It is her way. She's trying to protect you. She is trying to ensure the Dominion survives. Those are not always the same thing." Selith turned from the viewport. In the war room's dim light she looked carved from shadow and starlight. "Draven will invoke the right at the next full council. He has the votes. Because of me. Because of what you represent. A human. An outsider. A species so young that most Velshari cannot fathom why I would." She stopped. Her throat flared deep indigo. "Why you would what?" Kale asked. She looked at him, and for the first time, her composure, that exquisite, 17-year fortress of control, showed cracks. Her eyes shone with a moisture he had not known Velshari were capable of producing. "Why I would trust you," she said. "Why I would want you near. Why your presence has become the first thing in 17 years that makes the silence bearable." Her voice broke on the last word, and the bioluminescence along her arms erupted in a cascade of colors: anguish, longing, fury, tenderness. Symphony of emotions she had kept locked behind diplomatic perfection for nearly 2 decades. Kale stepped forward. Not diplomatically. Not carefully. He crossed the distance between them and took her hands. Her skin was cool and smooth, the bioluminescent threads beneath the surface pulsing against his palms like a second heartbeat. She flinched, not in pain, but in shock. Physical contact between an unbonded Velshari and an outsider was so far beyond protocol that there was no rule against it. No one had ever imagined it would happen. "Listen to me," Kale said. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled against hers. "You are not weak for wanting someone to see you. You are not compromised for being tired of performing. And you are not wrong for choosing to trust someone, even if that someone is a broken teacher from a planet most of the galaxy can't find on a map. They will take my throne. Then, let them take it. A throne that requires you to be empty is not worth sitting on." Her fingers tightened around his. The bioluminescence in her hands flowed into his skin, not painfully, but with a warmth that sank into his bones. He understood instinctively that this was the Velshari equivalent of weeping. "There is another way," Kale said. "What way?" "Let me stand before the council. Let me invoke the human right of testimony. It's buried in the Accord Charter, Article 17, Section 9. Any species with observer status can request a hearing before the full council if their representative faces expulsion." Selith shook her head. "The right of Velithar is not about your expulsion. It is about my fitness. It's about both. Draven's argument is that your judgment is compromised because you trusted a human. If I can demonstrate that trusting a human was not a weakness, but a strategic and cultural asset, his argument collapses. And if you cannot..." Kale looked at her hands and his twilight skin against sun-browned human fingers, bioluminescent. Threads pulsing between them like a shared language they were only beginning to speak. "Then I will have tried," he said. "And that will matter, even if nothing else does." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she did something no empress of the Velshari Dominion had done in recorded history. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his. It was the Velshari gesture of absolute trust, The voluntary exposure of the cranial nexus, the most vulnerable point of their anatomy, to another being. It was deeper than a kiss, more binding than a vow. It was the gesture reserved for bonded partners of decades, and she gave it to a human she had known for 23 days. Her light was rose gold again, that color he had seen only once in the garden. But now, it was everywhere, flooding her skin, radiating from her forehead where it touched his, filling the war room with a warmth that made the tactical displays flicker. "Then try," she whispered. The night before the council session, Cale could not sleep. He sat at his workstation, reviewing every document, every precedent, every cultural text he had accumulated in 14 months. He drafted arguments, discarded them, redrafted. He thought about what he would say to a room full of beings who viewed his species as clever animals, and he tried to find the words that would bridge 17 years of silence with 23 days of truth. His door chimed at the 3rd hour. He opened it to find Velshura, but she was not alone. Behind her stood a young Velshari melee, tall, broad-shouldered, with the aggressive bioluminescent patterns of a warrior caste. "This is Commander Velthar," Velshura said. "My grandson, Saleth's brother." The commander looked at Cale with an expression that combined military assessment with profound personal skepticism. "You are smaller than I expected. I get that a lot. You intend to stand before the council and defend my sister." "I do." Velthar's patterns shifted, a complex sequence that Cale recognized as the warrior's evaluation protocol. He was being measured, weighed, judged by standards that had nothing to do with physical size. "If you fail," Velthar said, "she loses everything. I know. If you succeed, you will be bound to her in the eyes of the Dominion. Protector and protected. The political implications. I'm not doing this for political implications." Velthar fell silent. He studied Cale with those same moon-silver eyes. The family resemblance was unmistakable, and something in his rigid expression softened by a fraction. "My sister has not shown her true light to anyone since she took the throne," he said. "I am told she shows it to you." Cale did not answer. Some things were not his to confirm. Velthar nodded, as though the silence itself was the answer he sought. "Then I will be present at the council. And if Draven moves against you physically," his patterns flared a deep, dangerous crimson, "he will need to move through me." After they left, Cale sat in the dark and allowed himself, for the first time in years, to feel something that was not grief. It was terrifying. The full council of the Galactic Accord convened in the Grand Rotunda, a spherical chamber at the heart of Thalashan Station that could seat over 300 delegates. Today, every seat was occupied. The bioluminescence of nearly 200 Velshari nobles alone created a shifting aurora across the vaulted ceiling. And the other species delegates, Kreth, Solani, Farathi, and a dozen others, added their own ambient spectra to the display. Cale stood at the petitioner's platform, a raised disc in the center of the chamber that was designed, he suspected, to make whoever stood on it feel exactly as exposed as possible. He wore his only formal garment, a simple dark suit he had brought from Earth, now slightly too large on a frame that had thinned during 14 months of station rations. Draven opened the proceedings. His case was methodical, elegant, and devastating. He presented holographic records of every protocol breach Saleth had committed since Cale's assignment. The change in walking position, the private meetings, the garden conversations. He presented biometric data showing shifts in her bioluminescent patterns, evidence, he argued, of emotional destabilization. He presented testimony from 3 noble houses attesting that the Empress had become distracted, unpredictable, and dangerously fixated on an alien of no standing. The Velshari Dominion, Draven concluded, has endured for 37 centuries because its rulers have placed the collective above the personal. Empress Saleth has abandoned this principle. She has elevated a human, a species that has not yet mastered its own internal conflicts, to a position of intimacy that compromises the integrity of the throne. The right of Velthar demands her removal. Applause was not the Velshari way. Instead, the chamber erupted in a wave of affirming amber light from Draven's coalition. It was substantial. It was nearly enough. The human representative has invoked the right of testimony under Article 17, the session moderator announced. He may speak. Cale stepped to the center of the platform. The chamber's acoustics were designed to amplify the speaker's voice while simultaneously allowing the audience to detect any physiological markers of deception. The Velshari could hear his heartbeat. They could smell his adrenaline. They would know if he lied. So he told the truth. Counselor Draven is correct, Kale began. The chamber flickered with confusion. Everything he has described happened. The Empress changed my position from behind her to beside her. She spoke with me privately. She shared aspects of her life that a Velshari ruler traditionally shares only with a bonded partner or a condemned prisoner. He paused. Given that I was assigned to the position traditionally held by one or the other, the irony is not lost on me. A ripple passed through the chamber. Not amusement exactly, but a loosening of tension that Kale recognized as an opening. But Counselor Draven's argument rests on a premise that I want to examine. He claims the Empress's judgment has been compromised by emotional attachment. He presents her willingness to connect with another being as evidence of weakness. Kale's voice was steady now, anchored by something deeper than rhetoric. I would like to suggest that the opposite is true. He looked at the assembled nobles, hundreds of faces that glowed with the contained emotions of a culture that had elevated composure to an art form. I have been among you for 14 months. In that time, I have learned more about the Velshari than any human before me, and I have come to respect your civilization profoundly. Your achievements in science, governance, and art are extraordinary. But I have also observed something that concerns me, not as a diplomat, but as someone who cares about the people in this room. He took a breath. You are afraid of each other. The silence that followed was not the controlled silence of protocol. It was the stunned silence of a nerve being struck. Every interaction I have witnessed in this chamber has been a negotiation. Every gesture calibrated. Every word measured for advantage. Your bioluminescence, the most beautiful and expressive communication system I have ever encountered, is treated not as a language, but as a vulnerability. You dim yourselves. You control yourselves. You hide. Draven's patterns flared crimson. You dare. I dare because that is apparently what humans do. Kale did not raise his voice. Counselor, you have spent weeks building a case that the Empress is weak because she lowered her guard with another being. But I ask you, in 3,700 years of rulers who never lowered their guard, how many of them were loved? How many of them were known? How many of them died having been seen, truly seen, by even one other soul? The chamber was painfully still. On Earth, Kale continued, we have a saying. The strongest walls make the loneliest prisons. Your Empress built walls that held an empire together. But those walls also held her in. And when she chose, not by accident, not by manipulation, but by her own sovereign will, to let someone past those walls, you call it weakness. He shook his head. That is not weakness. That is the most courageous thing I have ever witnessed. And I have witnessed courage, Counselor. I held my daughter's hand while she died 11 light years from the nearest hospital, and I could not save her, and I did not look away. I know what it costs to stay present when everything in you wants to retreat behind walls. His voice cracked. He let it crack. He let them hear it. The heartbeat, the adrenaline, the grief, the raw, unfiltered humanity of a man who was not performing. Empress Salith did not choose me because I am special. She chose me because I was the first person in 17 years who treated her as a person rather than an institution. That is not an insult to the Velshari. It is an indictment of a system that left its ruler so isolated that a stranger's honesty felt like a revolution. He looked at Salith. She sat in the imperial seat, her posture perfect, her expression composed. But her light was the rose gold he had seen in the garden and the war room, and it was not controlled. It was not dimmed. It poured from her like dawn breaking, and the nobles closest to her leaned away from it instinctively, as though from something too bright to face. You want to remove her for being emotional, Kale said. I say she is the first Velshari leader in millennia who has remembered what emotions are for. They are not weaknesses to be managed. They are the architecture of connection. They are how you build something worth defending. He stepped back from the center of the platform. I have nothing else to say. You will decide what you decide. But whatever you choose, know this. The Empress of the Velshari Dominion is not broken. She is not compromised. She is awake. And if that frightens you, then perhaps it is your own walls you should be examining. He sat down. The chamber was silent. The aurora of bioluminescence overhead had shifted to something Kale had never seen. A unified hue, spreading from noble to noble like a contagion. It was the deep, aching blue he had first seen in Saleth's throat on the night they met. The color of loneliness recognized. Velshura rose from her seat. The first mother's muted glow intensified for the first time in Kale's experience, burning with a steady amber that commanded the room's attention. "I call for the vote," she said. Draven surged forward. The discussion has been had, not today. For 17 years it has been had in silence, in the corridors, in the spaces between words. The human has merely said it aloud. Her gaze swept the chamber. "I call for the vote on the right of Velithar. Those who stand with Counselor Draven and declare the Empress unfit show crimson." A scattering of lights shifted red. Kale counted. 23. Draven's coalition but diminished. Several houses that had been aligned with him were conspicuously neutral, their patterns a non-committal silver. Those who reject the right show gold. The chamber bloomed. It was not unanimous, politics never was, but the gold was overwhelming, a warm, rich avalanche of light that swept from the lower seats to the upper galleries. Even some of Draven's former allies shifted, their patterns transitioning from crimson to gold with the reluctant inevitability of a tide turning. The final count was 147 to 23. Draven stood in his circle of crimson, his mandibles locked, his secondary eyes darting from face to face as allies abandoned him in real time. He looked at Kale, and for a moment, the hatred was pure enough to be almost admirable in its honesty. Then he dimmed his light to the neutral silver of acceptance, the Velshari equivalent of lowering one's sword, and sat down. "The right is rejected," Velshura announced. "The Empress retains her throne with the full confidence of the Council." The session ended. Delegates filed out in a cascade of shifting colors. Kale remained on the platform, suddenly drained, his hands shaking with the adrenaline he had denied his body for the past hour. He felt her before he saw her, a warmth at his side, and the faint scent of something like night-blooming jasmine, and a light that turned the platform into a small sun. Saleth stood beside him. Not behind. Not in front. Beside. "You are trembling," she said. "Humans do that after moments of extreme stress. It's embarrassing but physiological. Among my people, we would say your light is flickering." She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers interlaced with his, and the bioluminescent threads beneath her skin wrapped around his knuckles like luminous vines. "But I do not think you are flickering, Kale Morrow. I think you are burning." He looked at their joined hands, twilight and sunlight, alien and human. Two forms of warmth that should not have been compatible but were. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," she said, "I rule, as I have always ruled, but no longer alone. The nobles will talk. Let them talk. I have spent 17 years being the subject of whispers. At least now the whispers will be about something true." Commander Velthar appeared at the chamber's entrance, his warrior's patterns, a complex mix of relief and residual protectiveness. He saw their joined hands, and his glow shifted to a warm amber that Kale recognized, with a start, as familial approval. "Grandmother wants to see you both," Velthar said. Then to Kale, "She said to tell you that you are the most reckless creature she has encountered in 230 years, and that she is reluctantly impressed." "Reluctantly," she said. "The reluctance is important. It maintains standards." Saleth's hand tightened in Kale's, and a sound escaped her, low, startled, almost musical. It took him a moment to realize she was laughing. He had never heard a Velshari laugh. It was a sound like crystal resonating, and it echoed through the empty chamber, and it was the most human thing he had ever heard from a being born of starlight and silence. They walked together through the corridors of Thalashan Station, an empress of an ancient civilization and a broken teacher from a small blue planet, hand in hand, their footsteps synchronizing without effort. Delegates and officers stopped to stare. Some bowed. Some flickered with confusion or disapproval or wonder. Kale did not notice. He was thinking about what he had said in the council, about walls and loneliness and the courage it takes to let someone in. He was thinking about Alara and how she would have loved the bioluminescent trees in the garden, and how grief does not disappear but can, with time, make room for something else to grow alongside it. And he was thinking about the woman whose hand held his with a grip that said, more clearly than any language in the galaxy, "I chose this. I chose you, and I will not let go." Saleth stopped at the entrance to the matriarch's chambers. She turned to him, And in the corridor's soft light, her expression held none of the imperial composure that had been her armor for 17 years. She was simply a woman looking at a man who had called her lonely, and in doing so, had begun to make her not. Cale, yes, you were right. What you said in the council that first day. Her voice was quiet, but her light was a galaxy. I was lonely, I know. I am not anymore. She pressed her forehead to his again, that gesture of absolute trust, deeper than a kiss, and the rose-gold light that flowed between them was so bright that it cast shadows down the corridor. And the guards at their posts looked away, not from discomfort, but from the instinctive recognition that some moments are too luminous to witness from the outside. When they parted, Cale Morrow, the 19th human ambassador, the broken teacher, the man who had nothing left to lose and had therefore found everything, smiled. Neither am I, he said, and they walked through the door together.
Ja, genau. Machen wir mal Fahrprüfung mit den Jungs hier, genau. Das wäre interessant. Nee, besser nicht.
Also, das wäre schon interessant, ja.
Ich habe ein Patent für LKW und so erworben. So
Ich glaube, wir würden auch durchfallen.
ja, auf jeden Fall. Safe.
Würde jeder durchfallen. Würde jeder durchfallen. Also okay, wenn man so wirklich sich richtig Mühe gibt, ne? Und man sich wieder
Beide
so
Hände
zurück-
erstmal ins Lenker,
Ja.
Fenster,
Das ist schon das Problem.
dann Schulterblick man ist sowieso
genau.
immer.
Ja.
Davon mal, nee, also
Ja,
fahren
jetzt
kann
so
ich
ein
schon. So,
Tower,
das
Genau,
ist
wenn man sich
nicht
so richtig Mühe gibt und mal so wirklich sich so zurückerinnert, dann kriegt man
Wo ist der
schon.
Süden? Da hinten, glaube ich. Das hast du
Okay,
da
wie
hinten.
viel Zentimeter
aber
nach
Theorie
hinten
zum
darf die
Beispiel.
Ladung
So viele andere wollten
überstehen?
im Weg.
Genau, so ein, aber zum Beispiel Theorie.
Nein, das
Theorie
ist
geht
falsch.
gar nicht. Theorie schafft keiner mehr.
Das ist falsch, 30 Zentimeter.
Ja,
Oder was, Meter?
Richtig.
genau.
Meter
1
was?
Meter und 1,5 Meter, wenn man unter 100 Kilometer fährt.
Wie viel Abstand sollte man auf der Autobahn halten?
Halbe Terrorlänge.
Perfekt. Und bei Nässe?
Das anderthalbfache.
Du hast doch
Eigentlich
ausgemacht oder
nicht.
was?
Eigentlich
bei
ist
Philipp hört sich
also
das so
der
an, als
doppelte
hätte er
Abstand,
irgendwie
sprich
erst
der
was
komplette
gemacht.
Tacho. Und bei Schnee ist es die vierfache, also der doppelte Tacho.